In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the largest empire and the most formidable military force in Europe. He was on the cusp of launching an offensive against Russia, a maneuver precipitated by his continental system. This embargo was Napoleon's counteraction to the British naval blockade, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, which had severely hampered French maritime activities. Napoleon's continental system, a sweeping trade prohibition, mandated that European nations cease all commerce with Britain. Initially, even Russia acquiesced to this edict under duress from Napoleon. However, the alliance between Russia and France soon frayed. The embargo's significant impact on Russian traders, who suffered substantial financial losses, was a primary source of contention. Compounding these economic grievances was Napoleon's failure to honor a critical commitment to Tsar Alexander Bourbon of Russia. Napoleon had pledged to assist Russia in its potential acquisition of Constantinople, the contemporary Istanbul, a strategic nexus connecting Russia's Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, a conquest of considerable importance for Russia. Despite his assurances, Napoleon's fulfillment of this promise waned, as he harbored concerns that Russian dominance in Constantinople might challenge his own Mediterranean interests, akin to the formidable presence of the Royal Navy. The Tsar's disenchantment with Napoleon, exacerbated by the unkept promise regarding Constantinople and the financial repercussions of the trade embargo, culminated in Russia's withdrawal from the continental system and the resumption of commerce with Britain. In retaliation, Napoleon mobilized his troops against Russia, not with the intent to conquer, but to coerce Tsar Alexander back into compliance with his system. This begs the question, was Napoleon able to subjugate a power as vast as Russia? Moreover, how did circumstances evolve to the point where French cannons were turned against Napoleon himself? The stage for this historical drama was set on the banks of the Niemen River in Lithuania, at a site now known as Napoleon's Hill. On June 24, 1812, from this vantage point, Napoleon observed his Grande Armée, comprising an unprecedented 450,000 soldiers, including 80,000 cavalrymen, 370,000 infantry, and 1,400 artillery pieces, forge into Russian territory. Contrastingly, the Russian forces initially numbered only 230,000, with 40,000 cavalry, 180,000 infantry, and 800 cannons. While on paper the French army appeared supremely dominant, the situation in practice presented a different narrative. Half of Napoleon's forces were not French, which may imply a heterogeneous mix of loyalties and motivations. Many among the French were inexperienced youths, new to the rigors of war, unseasoned in combat, and ill-prepared for hardship. Conversely, while the Russian troops also included unseasoned workers and peasants, these individuals were inured to the extremes of their homeland's climate, whether the searing heat of summer or the brutal snows of winter. Such resilience gave them a marked advantage over the French when defending their territory. The French campaign's success hinged on numerical superiority and the strategic prowess of Napoleon, a commander whose reputation as an indomitable tactician was unrivaled. Yet, even Napoleon erred, having not devised a comprehensive strategy for the Russian incursion. His plan hinged on the assumption that the mere presence of his vast forces at the Russian frontier would be enough to intimidate Tsar Alexander into capitulation and a recommitment to the continental system, thereby ceasing trade with Britain. Thus, Napoleon halted at the Niemen River's edge, which demarcated the boundaries of the Russian and French empires, Poland and Lithuania lying on either side. As ruler of Poland, Napoleon awaited an overture of peace from the Tsar, but when none was forthcoming, he ordered the crossing of the river on June 24th, advancing into Russian dominions. Napoleon surmised that a mere 50-mile penetration into Russian territory would precipitate urgent peace negotiations, which would become known as the Battle of Borodino. The engagement was fierce and bloody, with massive losses on both sides. It was the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Despite the ferocity of the fighting, the battle was inconclusive in terms of a strategic victory. The Russian army, while heavily battered, was not destroyed and withdrew in good order. Napoleon managed to capture the battlefield, but he did not achieve the decisive victory he had hoped for. The Russian army was still intact, and General Kutuzov was able to conduct an orderly retreat to Moscow. As a result, Napoleon's hope of forcing Tsar Alexander to sue for peace by delivering a crushing blow to his armies faded. Following the battle, the French army, already weakened by the long march and the cumulative effects of supply issues, skirmishes, and disease, was further debilitated. When Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, he found the city largely abandoned. What followed was a disaster for the French. The famous Fire of Moscow, which began that night and lasted for several days, destroyed large parts of the city. Whether the fires were set deliberately by the retreating Russians or by accident by the occupying French soldiers, the result was the same. Moscow was not the supply depot Napoleon had desperately hoped for. Napoleon waited in vain for over a month in Moscow for a peace offer from Tsar Alexander that never came. With the Russian winter setting in, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. The withdrawal from Moscow began on October 19, 1812, marking the beginning of the end of the Grand Army. The retreat turned into a catastrophic flight from the pursuing Russian forces, compounded by sub-zero temperatures, famine, disease, and further Russian attacks. The once mighty Grande Armée was decimated by the time it reached the relative safety of friendly territory. Only about 20,000 fit soldiers from the original 450,000 to 650,000 who started the campaign were left when Napoleon's forces finally limped out of Russia. The disastrous Russian campaign was the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. It exposed the limitations of Napoleonic warfare and the vulnerabilities of his army. It also galvanized Napoleon's enemies, contributing to the coalition that would eventually defeat him. In 1814, following a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. His return to power in 1815, known as the 100 Days, ended with his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, after which he was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he spent the last years of his life. On the night of Napoleon's arrival, fires started breaking out across Moscow. At first, they seemed accidental, a result of the soldiers' negligence, but soon it became clear that these were acts of sabotage by the remaining Russian patriots, and perhaps orchestrated by the governor himself. The fires of Moscow were a catastrophic blow to the French. They had expected to find supplies and shelter in the city, but instead, they found an inferno. The great city of Moscow, the holy city of the Russias, became a hellish landscape. Despite efforts by the French to control the fires, they raged for days, devastating large parts of the city. The destruction of Moscow was the ultimate execution of the Russian scorched earth policy. It deprived Napoleon's Grand Army of much-needed supplies and shelter as the cruel Russian winter was approaching. Napoleon, who had lingered in the smoldering city for about a month, hoping in vain for a Russian surrender, or at least an offer of peace from Tsar Alexander Bonaparte, found himself in a precarious position. With winter looming, supply lines overstretched, and the army weakened by combat and scarcity, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat from Moscow. This retreat would become one of the most infamous disasters in military history. Harassed by Russian forces, suffering from cold, starvation, and disease, the Grand Army was decimated. The campaign in Russia marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. It exposed the vulnerabilities of his forces and emboldened his enemies. Within a few years, the once mighty Napoleonic Empire would be dismantled, and Napoleon himself exiled. The Russian campaign became a classic example of the perils of overextension in warfare and the ruthless effectiveness of a scorched earth defense, as well as a lesson on the futility of waging war against an adversary as vast and unforgiving as Russia. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow is one of the most harrowing tales of military history. It demonstrates how the elements, combined with guerrilla warfare, a lack of resources, and a demoralized army, can lead to a catastrophic outcome. His decision to stay in Moscow for as long as he did was based on a miscalculation. He had underestimated the Russian resolve and their willingness to sacrifice their own city to defeat him. By the time he realized that Tsar Alexander would not negotiate, it was too late. The winter had set in, and his army was ill-equipped to deal with the freezing conditions. The march back to Vilnius was disastrous. The army was bogged down by the loot they had taken from Moscow, which became a burden in their flight. They faced constant harassment from Russian forces and partisans. As the army's discipline broke down, the soldiers discarded their spoils in a desperate bid to survive. The Russian winter, the general winter that Tsar Alexander Weimar referred to, played a decisive role in Napoleon's downfall. The frigid temperatures, lack of food, and relentless Russian attacks took a grim toll. Many soldiers froze or starved to death, surrendered out of desperation, or were killed in skirmishes. By the time the remnants of the Grand Army reached Vilnius, they were a shadow of the force that had marched into Russia. It's estimated that of the roughly 600,000 men Napoleon led into Russia, only about 100,000 made it back. The army's suffering didn't end with reaching Vilnius either. The city was overwhelmed by the arriving survivors, many of whom were sick or wounded, leading to further deaths. Napoleon's personal flight from his army, using a sledge to return to France quickly, was indeed a practical decision for his own safety, but was seen by many as an abandonment of his men. It tarnished his reputation as an invincible leader and as one who shared the hardships of his troops. This devastating retreat from Moscow was a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. It marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's domination of Europe, as it sparked a coalition of his enemies and led to a series of defeats culminating in his first abdication and exile to Elba in 1814. Napoleon's return from exile on Elba, a period known as the 100 Days, is as dramatic as his retreat from Moscow. After his abdication and subsequent exile in 1814, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in the form of Louis XVI did not sit well with many French citizens and soldiers who had become disenchanted with the old regime. This dissatisfaction paved the way for Napoleon's return. Napoleon's escape from Elba and landing in France at Gulf Juan near Cannes on March 1, 1815, marked the beginning of a remarkable comeback. His journey from Cannes to Paris is a testament to his enduring charisma and the loyalty he commanded from his soldiers. The scene you describe, where Napoleon confronts the troops sent by Louis XVI and invites them to shoot their emperor, only to be met with cries of loyalty, is one of the defining moments of this period. His re-entry into Paris and reinstatement as Emperor of France showed that his hold over the imagination and aspirations of the French military and public was still strong. However, this resurgence was short-lived. The powers of Europe, having been disturbed by the return of the man they had worked so hard to unseat, quickly banded together to face him once more in battle. Napoleon's final stand came at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. The Duke of Wellington led the British forces, with substantial Prussian support under General Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher. Despite initial successes, Napoleon's forces were ultimately overwhelmed. The defeat at Waterloo ended Napoleon's rule as emperor once and for all, leading to his final exile to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he lived out his remaining days. The impact of the Russian campaign, his initial exile, the 100 Days, and his final defeat at Waterloo had long-reaching effects on European history. They not only ended Napoleon's rule, but also led to significant changes in the political landscape of Europe. The Congress of Vienna, which had been interrupted by Napoleon's return, resumed and would redraw the map of Europe, leading to a period of relative peace in Europe that lasted nearly a century, known as the Pax Britannica. The legacy of these events and Napoleon's role in them continues to be the subject of extensive historical debate and study. His military genius, his capacity for leadership, and his ultimate failures are often juxtaposed against the immense human cost of his ambitions. Whose legacy was cemented in that final confrontation? Was it the French emperor or the British commander? What became of Napoleon? These details will be unveiled, but in the subsequent and concluding installment. How Napoleon waged war against the Ottoman Empire, and how France ascended to the pinnacle of European power. These narratives are presented in these segments.